Czechoslovak history, and they've been contested, sometimes bitterly, over periods of time. And so in this talk, I kind of want to summarize what happened and why, and what are the issues that generated such drastically divergent viewpoints of the Slovak Republic. This title, Rock in a Hard Place, I started with that because it also applies to me. So, and it reflects the challenges of doing history and the profession of history. You know, history teaches us that the facts don't speak for themselves. They don't. You put a 1492 up and it can say a lot of things. It doesn't say this is exactly what it means. But on the other hand, facts do exist, you know, and so to say but they need to be backed by evidence. And so once a history is written, it's not preserved in stone. It's not like it's the same forever. New materials, access to archives, new questions asked by new voices, all demand re-examination of history. But this can lead to a dilemma. So, my father, who graduated from Comenius University in 1940, was a member of the Hlinka Academic Guard. He did serve in the Slovak government in the Ministry of Interior. He left with the Tiso government in 1945. And after escaping from Czechoslovakia, my mother, my sister, and I, we came to the United States in 1950. I grew up with the Slovak immigrant community, Kirchbaum, Mikuš, and everyone. So I was, you know, part of that emigre nationalist community. But when I began to study history and then went for a PhD, I thought, and I wanted to do Czechoslovakia, I realized I was indeed between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, you know, between the national narrative that I grew up with, which might challenge some of the people that I grew up with, and the other version. And when I got to grad school, my very first day in grad school, I'll never forget this. So I met the professor that was going to be my mentor, that guided my PhD, and his name was Walter Ullmann, and he had an accent, so I figured he was German. So then when he asked me why I wanted to study Czechoslovakia, I said that, well, you know, most of the history is written in Czech, and I want to write the Slovak version. And he switched to Czech, and he said, no, slečno, ale víte, že som Czech. And I thought, oh my God, my career is over. But it wasn't. He was wonderful. And one of the proudest moments of my life is an article I published in '93 about Czech and Slovak relations. And Walter, who was retired by that, wrote to me and said it was one of the best arguments for seeing the problems between Czechs and Slovaks. And that truly had to be my proudest moment. So I knew that I had to move, you know, that I had to kind of balance these demands, these rock and hard place. And so I decided to work on Milan Hoďa, Slovak, so I could still do Slovak history. But you know, I figured he wouldn't be that controversial. He was not part of the Slovak Republic. And it happened that during the communist era, there was almost nothing done about him. So I had access to materials, and I could, you know, research him. But his career also, even Hoďa, who was Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia from 1935 to 1938, a Slovak, even Hoďa had that push-pull of supporting the Czechoslovak and supporting, you know, the Slovak view, and he was caught between that. And it's this push-pull that does shape the historical assessment of the Slovak Republic, you know. And so, let's get to the fact. The fact is, Slovakia declared independence March 14th, 1939. But is independence the key fact, or is March 1939 the key fact? In terms of how it is interpreted. Where do you put the emphasis? The independence or the year, the trauma that's going on in Europe and the issues there. And after the war, the communist regime produced, you know, tended to produce ideologically constructed versions of the Slovak Republic to fit their narrative. And so these were very narrow. So then exiled Czech and Slovak historians often produce works of either the heroic Slovak or the fascist Hitler-controlled puppet. It was tended to be one or the other. New generations of American scholars did look at this issue and present more balanced views, but they often didn't have access to materials. They couldn't study. They couldn't get there. And so, you know, it was hard to do research. When I did my dissertation in 1969, or started it, I got a grant to go to Czechoslovakia. And it was 69 you know, when I arrived in May, it was still pretty free. By the time I left at the end of September, it was very much constrained. So I had a chance to find material and work with historians. And in fact, I'm going to plug a book that we're putting out. A number of us who did research, American scholars who did research under the communists, were putting together a book about researching under the communists and what the constraints were and what we had to endure in doing that. Then, of course, after the collapse of communism, the issues of 39-45 received a lot of new attention. Some of it polemic, but still based more and more increasingly on archival materials. I know I kind of diverged from the actual topic, but I thought that the contested narratives were part of the topic. You know, how do you present this event in history? And there are a number of issues here. The very idea of Czechoslovakism, what does that mean? You know, on the one hand, that Czechs and Slovaks are merely two branches of one nation, which is, you know, the standard Czech narrative. Or on the other hand, Slovakism, in which Slovaks and Czechs are distinct nations who form together. Is the emphasis on nation or on state? And again, you know, where do you put the emphasis? So there is actually a very good article by a Slovak scholar on the nature of Czechoslovakia, by a Norwegian scholar on the nature of Czechoslovakism, Elizabeth Bakke. She wrote a really good book looking at the idea of Czechoslovakism in the First Republic. So, you know, so that is part of the problem too. You have two people in a single country who have very different ideas about what that country means. What is its character? And another factor is the very definition of stateness. What does it mean to have a state? Not just what does it mean to have a nation, but what does it mean to have a state? For the Czechs, the state was a security issue. They needed to have the predominance. They needed to have, you know, Czechoslovak nation to be the majority. For the Slovaks, of course, it's having their rights of their own political future in there. And I think another one, Carol Leff, who's a wonderful scholar on Czech and Slovak relations, pointed out in her studies that people cannot decide structures until they decide who the people are. And so in some ways, you know, this notion of who are Czechoslovak. And so we come to 1938, of course, which brought about a fundamental change to Czechoslovakism, not in terms of the two different views, but in terms of the structure. And so, you know, between the Munich Conference, the Vienna Awards, and then in which Slovaks lost 22% of their territory and 27% of their population. One of the things, again, and if I had my PowerPoint, and I'm passing around the map on the backside of that front PowerPoint, shows the degree and this idea that somehow the Slovaks benefited from, you know, abandoning the Czechs, and they had all this territorial benefits, is wrong, because look at how much they lost too. Both sides lost.
How did they abandon the Czechs?
Well, we'll get to that. That's the narrative that the Czechs, you know, the Czechs claim that the Slovaks stabbed them in the back, but we'll get to that. So by the end of 1938, you had a change. You had the Žilina Accords, and then which created the second Czechoslovakia Republic, finally. And so, you know, there was this, it looked like a resolution. Now the question is, so we come to 1939. Now the question is, where do you go from there? And again, if I had my PowerPoint, I'm listing 6 key figures that made the decisions in the beginning of 1939 to the summer of 39. And they moved from moderates to extremists to an extent. Karol Sidor, who lived from 1901 to 53, he was one of the leaders of the Hlinka party. He served briefly, but he sought to find middle roads. And soon, of course, the Slovaks were, he left the government, and then he was sent to Rome to be the ambassador, where he stayed throughout the Republic.
Can you please define the time frame of Second Czechoslovak Republic, because that's important.
38, October 38 to March 1939. That's it.
To, well, not March 14th?
Well, yeah, March 14th, sorry. Yeah, March 14th, up to that moment. But yeah, it's from the Žilina Accords to March 14th, 1939, with the Declaration of Independence. Another one is Martin Sokol, who was a member and then chair of the Slovak SNIM, the Slovak Diet or Parliament. And he also tried to navigate different paths. Durchansky, who's Ferdinand Durchansky, who had different ministerial posts and a lot of times was declared to be an extremist, but he sought to give the Slovak government more options in foreign policy, so that he was removed by the order of the Germans in 1940, and although he continued to have government functions till 44. Then of course you come to the extremists, Alexander Mach, who pursued more radical pro-fascist policies. Initially he had only minor posts, but then he moved into the Ministry of Interior, and then after the end of World War II, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. You have Wojciech Tuka, probably the most extreme of the pro-fascist political figures in Slovak Republic, who served various functions, premier, deputy premier, foreign minister. He was tried and executed in 1946. And then there is Father Tiso, who is a very complicated figure, and one of the best studies that you can look at in terms of Tiso's history is to James Ward's book, you know, about about Tiso, in which he looks at him as priest, politician, collaborator, and looks at the spectrum of what happens as the Slovaks begin to lose more and more independence as it moves on through to the end of 1945, to the end of the war, and especially after 44, when you know, basically you have German control in 1944. So these 6 figures are not the only decisive ones, but in that tumultuous year of 1939, they reflect that there were different paths towards independence, not different paths towards staying, because that would have been death, but independence. You know, or degrees of what the rest of the world called extremism, from hopes of genuine independence all the way to authoritarian, and then later to totalitarian, you know, society. So before March 14th, they basically began to set up the new structure that had been agreed upon. You know, there were elections to a new diet in December of 38. The issue was, do you want a new free Slovakia, yes and no, and it was overwhelmingly yes. There were members elected to the new SNEM by a 97% vote. The new government Sokol was the chair, Tiso was the head of the autonomous government, and Tiso voiced the program, building our state, our new state, our Slovak state. An ambiguous statement, but at no point did he talk about, you know, breaking away. It's still within the framework of Czechoslovakia. So within this gradual move, perhaps, you know, recognizing Slovak demands. But in the meantime, of course, there's increased German pressure. And the radical wing, led by Tuka, is in meetings with Hitler. And so Hitler already told Tuka in February that if they did not want Slovakia to revert to Hungary, they had to declare independence. And so there's pressure. But as late as March 6th, Tiso wrote, we are continuing to build Slovak state by evolutionary route and not declare independence immediately. He's keeping both sides open, which is a good politician to do that. You know, to
He went after the Pittsburgh Agreement.
Yeah, and well, that's been part of the whole history of that Pittsburgh Agreement. Was that one of the basic issues in terms of Czechoslovakianism, and Baki does a good job, and other scholars do a good job of doing that. So, and at that moment, it's still not clear what's going to happen. So it isn't as if there was plotting to create an independent Slovakia. People just weren't really sure what was going to happen. And so you could say that at this moment, it wasn't planned but pushed. You know, that the push came rapidly. As a report of Minister Carr in Prague to the United States Department of State on March 9th, Czechs are talking to Slovaks in a much more confident tone, have reason to believe or suspect that there is a certain amount of bluff involved in both sides in relations between Czechs and Germans, and that Berlin is not actually going to raise any serious objections if the Czechs insist on increased political control over Slovakia. This is the American minister writing back to on March 9th, writing to the Department of State. Shows how little was really known at the time, you know? But Prague now decides to intervene. They believe that a coup was being planned by the Slovaks by the radical wing. So on the night of March 9th and 10th, the Czech government sent, or still the Czechoslovak, sent in troops. Tiso was removed as president of the autonomous government. The gendarmes occupied key places. What?
Tiso was put into a convent.
No, well, he went back to his parish. Yeah.
Well,
no, but no, part of it.
Really. Part
of it was also he volunteered to leave. But yeah, again, these are the different opinions. This is what's at stake here. You cannot.
They put him into a convent.
He went to his parish. Yes. So there, you know, so Tiso was left. Sidor, actually another Slovak priest was. They asked him to serve. He said no. So Sidor took over. He was head of the autonomous Slovak government. He, however, pointed out that this was an attempted takeover, and the Czechs retreated because the Hlinka Guard stood up to them, and so they pulled their troops back in March 11th. Sidor was concerned about what should be the next step. As pressure mounted, he wondered what else the Czechs would do. He thought that the fact that the Czechs kind of retreated so quickly might have been because they counted on Russia to challenge Germany. Little did they know that a few months later would be the Nazi-Soviet pact and that Russia and Germany would be allies for 2 more years till Hitler made the stupidest move of his career, and that was to invade Russia. You know. So now the Nazi pressure intensified. The Austrian foreign minister visited Sidor on the night of March 12th to pressure him to declare independence. Sidor said no. Tiso, who had returned to his parish, wherever, was now called to Berlin. he went to Berlin on March 13th, and he was told either to declare independence or there would be no protection for the Slovaks and as Hungarian.
Excuse me, there was one little thing. Hitler called up the Hungarian ambassador in Berlin. And this is a telephonic transcript
Yes.
in Book of Mary Hyman, you know.
Yeah,
And told him that I'm going to declare Slovak independence.
yes,
And that's very important.
that's, yeah, no, that's what, yeah.
And so Tiso was finished.
Tiso, well, Tiso could
What
either.
could he do
Yeah,
against
that's
Hitler?
my point, that Tiso could either agree or he could
Give him-
give up. That's why it's between a rock and a hard place. That rock that's Hungary would fall down,
Oh,
you know, on the state. So it's between a rock and a hard place. What do you do at that point?
had nothing to do.
So Tiso, you know, Tiso called Haka in Prague and said convene the Slovak SNEM because it's still part of the Czechoslovak Republic.
Excuse me, the visit of Tiso on 12th of
13th.
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the first part of the day came Tiso, when Hitler told him, I declare. The second part came Dr. Hacha with his daughter.
Yeah,
And when Hitler told him, I am going to take over Bohemia or Czech Republic, so he fainted and the doctor had to claim, you know. So, you know, these were dramatic events which should be not avoided, you know.
no, and no one is avoiding it. I'm
Okay.
saying it is between a rock and a hard place.
That is a very good point.
And once again, we see how you can take a set of facts as a historian, and depending on how you can start emphasizing, as I said, independence, March 14th, 1939. Do you focus on independence? Do you focus on March 39? And it depends on where you put the emphasis is what kind of narrative you are going to be focusing on. Which one is the more important aspect of it? And so, anyway, Tiso decides that he has no choice, that in discussion, in discussion, it's decided that the Slovaks will declare independence, but they will also have a defensive treaty with Germany. And that defensive treaty is signed to give them protection. Tiso comes back, calls for a vote, and Pavel Czarnogórsky, whose son later becomes active in the post-92 or post-89, gives a description of that date. Given this historic date, Bratislava is quiet. A SNEM is called. However, police surrounded the SNEM building, though however, no police surrounded the SNEM building. Though through a small walkway between Kapučinský kostol and Mariánska socha, the academic guard from Svoradov, which was the dormitory for students.
Yeah, I'm a Svoradovian.
Yes, so was my father. My father was a Svoradovian. Yeah. Stood silently as they called the SNEM. Czarnogórsky, as then head of the Hlinka Guard, did not call out the Hlinka Guard. He did not expect to need to. Sidor rose to speak. He said, I replaced Tiso outside the legal procedures. Given the international situation, I am not capable of continuing, and so he resigns. Sokol then stepped up and called for a break, and they returned to a secret session. Tiso spoke passionately about the certain fate of Slovaks, if not independent, and that immediate action was needed. Tiso said, it's a question of life or death, and this depends on whether we grab this moment. So the vote was by standing. It was not a roll call vote, it was by standing, and then everyone stood, although there are varying narratives again whether everyone stood or not, but then they broke into Hey Slováci. And so this was the Declaration of Independence. Czarnogórsky says in his memoirs about that day, we understood that it no longer was about the state, which was just a form, a structure, but about the nation. And again, this is this dilemma, this issue, you know, of nation or state. Hitler confirmed the independence with a telegram on March 16th, and then on March 23rd, the Treaty of Protection was signed with Berlin. And the document decreed that the new state must carry out its foreign, military, and economic policy in close coordination with Germany. So there was enough vagueness that sometimes they irritated the Bratislava Germans, who were quite numerous. James Ward, in writing about this period in Tiso, said, had the European order hardened around Czechoslovakia, independence might not have come, at least not then. But could they have? You know, could they have made decisions? Key figures of the Czechoslovak government went into exile. Beneš left in 38, so he's not around to deal with this. Hoxha left in 38, so key figures. So, you know, the Slovaks were independent, but what did it mean? They set up new structures, they set up a constitution, they had, you know, elections. One of the interesting points of their constitution was that national groups which have homes on territory of Slovakia had the right to organize culturally and politically under their own leadership, have the right to use their own language in public schools and in public life. The Consul General of the United States in Prague sees this as straddling authoritarian, that this clearly favors the Germans. But you can see that it was a more moderate position, because the German in Bratislava got angry and in their newspaper warned that there are certain things that will have to be changed. But I also think that this is a legacy of the Slovaks living under Hungary, when during that whole time that they lived in Hungary, they could not have their schools. They could not have, you know, use their language publicly in education. And I think this part clearly, so the Slovaks in that first year are wrestling with what is independence and what is the limit of independence. They passed the law of citizenship as to who could be a citizen. Among the interesting things were that if you married a Slovak, you didn't automatically get citizenship, which is an interesting issue. You know, and then they sought international recognition. And they got international recognition from 27 countries, including Britain, France. The Soviet Union had a mission in Bratislava, and they gave de jure, which is by law, as well as de facto. The others gave de facto. They recognized it, but without necessarily all the legal terminology. They were there, of course, until 1941, and then that changed. The Vatican was nervous about a Catholic priest taking a political role, but they did recognize Slovakia in March of March 25th, and they sent a nuncio to Slovakia. He had been in Prague, and so he stayed a few months, left, and then the office remained vacant until 1940. In the meantime, Sidor was appointed to the Vatican in late June, early July, and in 39, and he stayed till the end of the war. The U.S., this is the interesting part. The U.S. was pressured by some Slovak groups to recognize, and then by other Slovak groups not to recognize. Dubčanský, as foreign minister, made several appeals after March 14th to the United States for recognition. They literally ignored it. They didn't answer. It was like they never got this. Mr. Joseph Husak, who was president of the Slovak League of America on April 24th, 1939, wrote to Franklin D. Roosevelt, "Mr. President, may I appeal to you to bear in mind the fate of Slovakia. The Slovaks all over the world look to you and to men of your vision for assistance. Trusting to your devotion, Slovakia will not again become a helpless victim of her more powerful and aggressive neighbors. It is the fervent desire of the Slovak Americans that the United States will be one of the first to recognize the Republic of Slovakia, thereby giving its people courage and faith with which to meet the future and strengthening the spirit of democracy. He was ignored. There was no response. He did not meet. In fact, after a couple of other attempts, later members of the Slovak League of America were being investigated by the FBI for being possible agents of Germany. And when Husak asks in October 6th and again in October 28th, he asked, 39, he asked Martin Diaz, who was a senator from Texas, a congressman from Texas, and he was head of the House Committee of Un-American Activities, which, you know, eventually McCarthy will take that over, for explanation as to why there was some investigation of members of the Slovak League. There was no answer. Again, it was ignored, dismissed. Why did the U.S. take this position? First of all, FDR never accepted or recognized the Munich Agreement. And so he didn't want to, you know, in that sense, the policy was consistent. All those changes between 38 and 39 were not recognized. Contacts with Beneš were very critical too. Beneš was at the University of Chicago and certainly contributed to the perception that Slovakia was simply another German protectorate. A delegation of Slovak Americans to the White House, led by Dr. Peter Hledko, in October of 1940, recalled FDR saying that President Beneš was his friend, and they were interested in restoring Czechoslovakia. And so, another factor may have been the negative view of Slovaks. Very interesting reports were sent by George Kennan, who in that period was in Prague and writing. Roman Ličko, another very good Slovak historian, has an excellent article on this. Kennan was there from 38, he arrived the day of the Munich conference, until September of 39. In his report of January 1939, he wrote about Slovak autonomy, at that time still autonomy. He said, they're not ready. They have vague hopes of developing their own country, but little idea how to do it. In short, they are all dressed up and have no definite place to go. They were and remain largely a rural people. Czechs did great things for the Slovaks, and then he adds, interestingly, but constantly antagonizing the more easygoing and imaginative Slovaks with their Czech aloofness, their suspiciousness, and their schoolmasterish attitudes. They treated like they were the best teaching the Slovaks. Kind of ironic because, you know, the Time magazine in 1968, when Dubček came to power, and then, of course, declared the Prague Spring, and the Soviets were so surprised because Dubček had, you know, trained in Moscow, and Time magazine said, well, they forgot he was a Slovak. And that Slovaks drink wine, and Czechs drink beer, and Slovaks are freer people. The same kind of image of the Slovaks as being, you know, we're good people, we're a happy people kind of image. So even Kennan, who's, you know, very critical.
Not the book.
Yeah, no, it's the documents from that period. Yeah, I have that book. In a later report, May 1, Kennan compared Slovaks to a dog on a leash. Said Slovak leaders cannot resist an occasional pulling of the leash, you know, trying to be free, but will have to experience frequent tugs on the leash as Germany steps in. And of course, the Slovak situation worsened once they joined the war against Poland, which was a quick war. They got back, while they got the territory lost to Poland, they got it back. They lost the recognition of the Western powers, except of course the Soviet Union until 1941, because the Soviet Union was also part of the attack on Poland in there. The couple more points, the internal life of the new republic. Most people did not seem threatened or threatening. Life went on as before, and in fact for some years the Slovak state had a calmer and more stable existence than other societies. Economic growth occurred. There were new infrastructures of roads and rail lines. Their standard of living improved for most people, though not all, but jobs that had large Czech presence were now shifted over to the Slovaks, especially that allowed them to work in state bureaucracies, in the schools, in the science field, in various areas. And agricultural production increased, and the currency was stable, so that to a large extent, at the end of 1939, most Slovaks would have thought that independence was the right decision. There were, of course, some who resisted. While there was not much support for Beneš, there was who continued to assert that the Slovaks were not a separate people. In fact, he said in 1949, I will never call the Slovaks a nation. They are not a people. I refuse to use that term. He said this in 1942. But, he wasn't exactly popular among any Slovak resistors. There were voices for alternative paths, Protestants, many with deep roots in the Slovak national movement of the early 20th century, like Hoďa and others, felt increasingly isolated in this new Catholic definition of Slovakia. And so there was a nostalgia for Hoďa and for a different vision for Slovakia. And Hoďa himself, who left Czechoslovakia in 1938, kind of briefly reemerged in in political life. In Paris in November 22nd, 1939, he formed a Slovak National Council in exile. While this only lasted briefly, Hoďa did become, until his death in 1944, a voice for a new federal hyphenated Czechoslovakia. So Hoďa moves, and this is the reality of the experience. Hoďa moves from Československý rozkol, in which he says there's just one language, all the way to Czechs and Slovaks are separate and we need a hyphenated federal republic. He didn't have much success. And there is a really good book, Hoďa versus Beneš, that looks into the conflict between them in exile in the 40s. Undeniably, the most tragic and most damning aspect of the Slovak Republic was the Jewish policy. Anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe, which is no excuse. This anti-Semitism manifested itself more openly after independence. The government decree of April 18, 1939, which was not passed in Parliament but was implemented by decree, defined Jews. Those who were not baptized before October 30th, 1918 were Jews. Also non-religious parents, or non-religious persons whose parents were Jews were classified as Jews. But it was based on religion, not race. That was the key factor. The second part of the decree dealt with professions, lawyers, notary publics, later doctors, teachers. A figure of 4% was permitted to be held by Jews in those professions. The second decree of April 24th removed them from public services. Military service was continued, and one of the ironic factors which the Germans then really attacked Slovaks for was that in the September invasion of Poland, there were some Jewish captains and leaders of the Slovak troops, and some Germans had to salute to a Jew, and they were furious, and so they put tremendous pressure on the government to remove them from the military, so later separate military groups were produced. But these percentages, for instance, were not closely followed out of necessity. And so the first year there were so many exemptions granted and requested by both Slovaks and Jews that it was not this wide-scale cleansing, which will come later as the Slovaks lose their power to decide for themselves. Aryanization followed, but the first year, and we're talking only about 39, it was relatively modest, mainly voluntary in many instances, as a way of protection. I have to say that my grandfather became an Aryan controller under this policy because my grandfather was an architect and had his own construction company in Ružomberok. In fact, his company built Hlinka's memorial in Ružomberok. So, and his partner was Jewish. And when these laws went into effect, my grandfather became the controller of that. This Jewish family was able to leave because many, again, in the first year, we're not talking about later, in the first year, many were able to voluntarily emigrate for a certain amount of money paid. And so this Jewish family emigrated. And then in 1945, they came back. My grandfather had kept total books, divided everything, you know, gave the profits back to the, you know, half the profits to the Jewish family. And then, ironically, both of them lost everything when the communists took over and took their company. You know.
I just say a word. There were virtually no difference economically and otherwise between the handling of the Jewish people in protectorate in Slovakia. There was no difference. It was all the same. Aryanization, persecution, and everything. So we have to again put it in. There is not that only in Slovakia, but actually Slovakia handled them only from a religious point of view. In protectorate it was an ethno.
But later, honestly, later it became more radicalized. It really did.
Later, you know, it was
and I know, we're only talking about 39 and it was fine.
To mention the Jewish soldier, there is a very interesting book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers.
Yeah.
And for instance, Goering's second general, Milk, was Jewish. And what Hitler said, I am going to say who is Jewish. You know, so these were very difficult things. A lot of half-Jews was SS men, you know.
Yeah, I know. So we need to confront reality.
Exactly.
We cannot escape what was done. And so, you know, yes, in the first year, it was relatively moderate, and it was based on religion and some economic consideration. But full Aryanization follows, then deportation, which was launched in March 42. Now, the Slovaks canceled it then in October of 42 when they realized what was happening, but then it was resumed once the Germans fully occupied Slovakia in 44. And so this tragedy must be recognized, accepted, and vowed never to repeat again. You cannot escape your history any more than you can escape your shadow. Your history is part of you.
What was interesting, you know, that stopping of the deportations was actually the result that the Slovak Catholic Bishop Wojtaszek stood up after he got the information from the Slovak soldiers fighting against Soviet Union, how the Jewish are handled. And so he stood up, and so they stopped the deportation. So let's just say how it is.
Well, no, but I'm talking about 1939, so I'm focusing on that. And they did not do that kind of deportation in 39. No, it came later. And of course, the more that you came under control of the Germans, the less and less options you had. So, conclusion, because I've talked long enough, and it's boring without the PowerPoint, sorry about that. But extremely controversial period in Slovak history. And even the harshest critics of the Slovak Republic do acknowledge that there was little room for maneuver. You know, one very strong critic did admit that the Slovaks would have been taken over by the Hungarians, but they should have taken the long view. Excuse me, who could have had the long view in 1939? Certainly not the reports coming in from the State Department. Certainly not the expectations of the Czechs that Russia would come to their aid. Certainly not, certainly not the idea that in a few months the Soviet Union would turn around and with Germany move into Poland. So I just read an article in the New Yorker reviewing intelligence gathering books, on different books about intelligence gathering. And the conclusion of the article by the author is, how intelligent is national intelligence reporting? Exactly as smart as we are. And that's a terrifying thought. Because in some ways, their own prejudices, their own lack of, their own expectations that this is what's going to happen, their own preconceived notions. The reports about the Slovaks that were sent to the State Department were sent from Prague. They weren't in because they refused, once the independence was declared, they refused, the State Department would not allow any offices in the Slovak state. So how how can you say that they should have taken the long view? The long view at that point could have been, and certainly would have been, disaster. When the Slovak Republic, and Carol Leff, again, does an interesting analogy, and she talks about the influence of international issues on internal politics. And and that's a critical factor. And you could carry that over, that the international situation of Pearl Harbor led the United States to take American-born Japanese citizens and put them in camps. So, you know what? International factors will impact internal relations. And so when the Slovak Republic was proclaimed, many thought this was an opportunity to build a genuine state. Many, almost all critics and supporters alike, agree that Slovakia went through several stages in this trauma as World War II unfolded. And that the first stage, from 1939 to summer 1940, until Tiso was called to Salzburg, that up until then, while there were hints of what would happen, that this was an attempt at moderation with some diversity of views and hopes for the future. Hopes that faded as war, fascism, and fear took root and freedom disappeared. The Czechs and Slovaks, let me finish with an analogy of a marriage. The Czechs and Slovaks got married in 1918. Hlinka said, the 1,000-year marriage with Hungary is over. It's time for a divorce. They got married. It was a wartime marriage. They didn't get to know each other very well. The marriage was brokered by outsiders. For the Slovaks, it was brokered in America. During their marriage in the First Republic, the husband, assumed that this was one nation, one Czechoslovak group. The wife said, wait a second, don't I have some rights in this? Can I have a voice? And when the storm clouds of war occurred on the scene, the marriage was already foundering. It was not that this created the end of the marriage. But for the Czechs, this was a vicious divorce. They called it a stab in the back that the Slovaks left them. And the Slovaks said, where were you helping us until you needed us? And so a marriage, this kind of unequal, and this is the article that I wrote that Professor Ullman forgave me for being Slovak and said it was a wonderful article. Analogy. So thank you for listening.